Welcome to our module on implementing peer support arrangements for students with autism. I am pleased to welcome you back to the second of two modules aimed at supporting all students to access the rich range of social and learning opportunities that exist throughout their schools, and to express my gratitude for all the investment you are making in creating communities of belonging for all students. This presentation is a joint venture of the Human Development Institute and the Kentucky Autism Training Center. Thank you for being part of this work in schools. Let me begin by taking you back in time for just a moment. Can you remember some of your favorite classes in school? What were your all-time top five of the many, many courses you took through elementary and middle and high school? Maybe it was a performing arts class like choir or drama or music. Perhaps it was an elective like computers or family studies, a foreign language or PE. Or maybe it was one of the core academics, a science class, a language arts course, or some type of history or social studies course, or dare I suggest math? Probably not. Whatever comes to mind for you, and I suspect it is different from one person to the next. What was it about those classes that made you look forward to the ringing of that starting bell? Was it the subject matter that captivated you? The chance to learn about some topic that fascinated you or was just so interesting to explore? Was it the teacher? Someone who just came alive when teaching, who had a knack for helping you connect to the subject matter, who just made you feel special, or who supported you so well and expected so much? Or was it your classmates? The chance to spend time with and learn alongside other kids who shared your interests or who made you laugh or just made the class a fun place to be. Or perhaps it was a combination of all of these, the things you learned, the place you learned it, the people you learned alongside. The classes our students take make up the bulk of their school day. And our charge as educators is to make the most of these rich and diverse learning opportunities. Quite often, our conversations about what it means to do this well tend to emphasize providing students with access to strong instruction and learning experiences that are marked by their rigor and their relevance. And such a focus is absolutely important. But if you were to ask most students to reflect on their own school experiences, like I just asked you to do, you would be quite likely to hear about the ways in which their relationships mark their memories and shape their sense of self. Supportive and satisfying relationships can enhance their engagement in school. It contributes to a sense of belonging. It creates rich context for learning within and beyond the classroom. And the absence of such relationships can lead to loneliness and isolation and disengagement and dissatisfaction from school. Attention to relationships right alongside rigor and relevance is at the heart of strong schooling for all students. And this is no less true for children and youth with autism. But what does it look like to support students with autism well in ways that promote access to rigor, relevance, and relationships? How are we doing right now in these areas? And what are things that we should be doing better or more of or entirely different? Well, more and more students with autism are spending a greater proportion of their school day in classrooms alongside their peers without similar disabilities. Elective classes, related arts classes, and academic classes. The trends in inclusive practices nationally provide some encouragement, and they convince us that not only is inclusion possible, but it's happening all around the country. I've placed on your screen a display of where students with autism spend their school day nationally, from 2000 to the most recently available data. The bottom blue is the percentage of students spending 80% or more of their school day in general education classrooms. These are students who are nearly fully included. The green is the percentage of students spending their day in a mix of general and special education classrooms, between 40 and 79% of time included. The yellow is the percentage of students who spend most of their day in the same school, but in special education classrooms. They are included less than 40% of the day. And finally, the top bar in orange, it's the percentage of students in other settings, specialized schools just for kids with disabilities or other settings altogether. It's a pretty mixed portrait of practices. And a similar mix can be found right here in Kentucky. Looking at the most recently available data, 40% spend most of the day in general education, 27% are in a mix of general and special education classes, 31% spend most of their day in special education classes, and a very small percentage are in different settings. So, as you might expect, involvement in general education drops off considerably as you turn to those students with the most significant disabilities, those who are eligible for the alternate assessment. Now, I'd like you to think about your own local school, where you work, or where your kids are enrolled. How does the picture of general education participation compare? Is there room for improvement? Are there opportunities that still await? Well, the question we'll be wrestling with in this module is much less about classroom location, as important as that is, and much more about supports and opportunities. In other words, when students with autism are participating in inclusive classes, and so many are they meaningfully engaged in the learning opportunities that take place there? And are they participating in a variety of peer interactions and collaborative experiences that comprise that class? A class isn't inclusive if no one talks to a student except a teacher. And a class isn't inclusive if the student is not supported in accessing the curriculum that comprises that course. Location matters, but supports and opportunities may matter much more. I emphasize this point because study after study highlights just how common it can be for students with autism to be present in a class, but not have a presence in that class, to be enrolled in a class, but to not be engaged. Well, let me illustrate by pulling from two of our recent studies, one involving younger students and another involving older students. A few years ago, we completed a study that involved class-length observations of 6 elementary and middle school students with autism who also used aided or unaided AAC to supplement existing communication. Within their general education classrooms, these students participated in any type of social interaction between 1/4 and 3/4 of all observation intervals. I've put that on your screen. This is the percentage of intervals that they had any social interaction. However, when we looked closer at who was involved in these interactions, it became clear they took place almost entirely with paraprofessionals and special educators who were providing one-to-one support. The light green is the percentage of all interactions that took place with peers. Less than 6% for Aaron and Jennifer and Adam. None for Alicia and Arthur. And only Sam had a proportion of peer interactions that were fairly sizable. Is this the portrait of social inclusion that we hope our students experience? Or do we want something more? How about a high school example? Well, we conducted 297 class-length observations of 99 high school students with severe disabilities who were enrolled in general education courses. About 42 of them had a label of autism. And we also observed peers without disabilities from the same classrooms. Here's what we found. Peers without disabilities averaged about 97 interactions with their classmates during a class period. That's the dark green bar. Students with disabilities, just 14. That's the light green bar. Peers without disabilities were academically engaged in instruction about 83% of the time. Students with disabilities, just 63% of time. And peers without disabilities almost never sat right next to a paraprofessional. Students with disabilities did so half the time. Same general education classroom, very different portraits of participation. What might need to be in place to change the quality of the experiences in these classrooms? What makes the difference between students with autism for whom interactions with peers and active engagement in class are prominent and those who lack these social connections and academic engagement? Well, the published literature highlights a number of important elements that might make a difference. I'll place them on your screen and briefly mention them here. First, presence is essential, and I suspect this is obvious, but social interactions cannot take place if students are not in the same places, at the same times, doing the same things, and that's the simple definition of shared activities. If students aren't involved in shared activities within the classroom, Don't be surprised if interactions are few and far between. Second, proximity also matters. Because even within inclusive classrooms, students with autism may be on the peripheries of ongoing activities, or often physically apart from their peers. In our study of inclusive elementary school classrooms, we found that students were not in close proximity to any other classmate 41% of the class period. And in our high school study, we found that students were not in proximity to any other classmate 58% of the class period. They may have been sitting next to the paraprofessional instead of alongside peers, working at a separate table with other students with disabilities, or gone from the classroom. Students cannot converse or collaborate if they are nowhere near one another. Third, a reliable means of communication must be in place. Some students with autism lack a reliable and understandable mode of communication. AAC devices that are in working condition and readily available and aligned with the settings they're in. In the first project I mentioned, we observed that elementary and middle school students who had AAC devices were not in proximity to their device nearly 60% of the class period. Fourth, relevant information and training may be needed. The awareness and the attitudes of peers can impact their receptivity towards spending time and developing friendship with a classmate with autism. Limited knowledge about disabilities, uncertainty about how to interact with someone who has complex communication needs or behavioral challenges, or questions about someone's capabilities, those things can make peers reluctant to initiate interactions or even to pursue relationships. And reluctance so often leads to avoidance. Providing accurate and relevant information can ensure peers feel confident and confident in their interactions. And finally, sufficient support. The roles of paraprofessionals and special educators can either help or hinder positive interactions among students with and without autism in the classroom. As students get older, the constant presence of adults can limit peer interactions and shared learning opportunities, as well as lead to greater stigmatization. In fact, it's becoming more and more common for students to be supported by a paraprofessional within inclusive settings. On the flip side, the facilitative role of a staff can be instrumental in creating connections among students and supporting active participation. So, supporting and striking that right balance between providing just enough adult support to promote participation, but not too much support to stifle the development of relationships, that is absolutely essential. Now, certainly there are other important elements I could mention, but consider these 5. In light of the very uneven experiences of students with autism in inclusive classrooms, and what we know about the factors that foster interactions and engagement, what steps might you take to promote relationships and learning in the classroom? Well, peer support arrangements present a practical and evidence-based approach for supporting inclusive learning opportunities for students with autism. So what exactly are peer support arrangements? Well, they involve equipping and supporting one or more peers to provide ongoing social, academic, or behavioral support to an individual with autism. Similar age peers are recruited from within the same setting. They participate in an initial training regarding their roles. They provide individualized support suggested within a written plan, and they receive ongoing guidance and feedback from professionals as they work alongside their classmate. Now, typically, this is a paraprofessional, but it could be other school staff. Socially, those peers might model age-appropriate communication and social skills. They might encourage contributions to ongoing discussions in the setting. They might prompt use of a communication device if the student uses one, or they might simply encourage social connections to other classmates. Academically, working closely with peers may increase the amount of individualized supports and corrective feedback and response opportunities students with autism receive, as well as the extent to which the activities and materials they are accessing aligns with what other students in this setting are using. This support model typically starts toward the beginning of the year and then lasts throughout the semester. As students begin working together, the paraprofessionals shift from a direct to indirect support role, strategically facilitating social and academic participation as students work together through much or maybe even all of the class period. Peer support arrangements are designed to increase communication opportunities and decrease reliance on adult-delivered support by creating well-supported, shared activities. In contrast to one-to-one paraprofessional support roles, students with autism come to receive most, though certainly not all, but most of their assistance from their classmates, just like any other student would do. And the students are all part of a community of learners, drawing each other into learning. Who then is involved in a peer support arrangement? Well, as with the peer network interventions, which we discussed in the first module, these interventions are built around an individual student with autism. We'll call this the focus student in this module too. Although most of the research on these approaches have involved middle and high school students, peer support arrangements can also be implemented for students across the grade span. And while most research is focused on students with autism who also have an intellectual disability, there have also been studies with students who are doing fine academically but just struggle socially. Now, students without disabilities who are actively involved in providing support throughout the class period are called peer partners. Now, ideally, 2 or 3 peers would serve in this role. Definitely no more, ideally no less. And we'll talk more about how they're selected a bit later on. But for now, it's important to note that they come from the same classroom. They agree to this role. And, they could be students who themselves have a learning disability or some other high incidence disability. A successful peer support arrangement also involves someone in the role of a facilitator. Now, most often, this is a paraprofessional whose role is to provide support within the inclusive classroom. In many cases, this paraprofessional provides one-to-one support to the student. In other cases, they support multiple students with disabilities who are enrolled in the same classroom. Now, the roles of this individual are to actively facilitate social connections with other classmates, to monitor peer support arrangements, to ensure students are participating actively in all learning activities, to collect data on social and learning progress, to collaborate with general and special educators to carry out well-planned supports, and to strategically fade back their direct support when it's not needed. Now, although a special educator could readily facilitate the peer support arrangement, they typically do not, unless they have a regular presence in the classroom or they're co-teaching, for example. Instead, their roles may be to carry out any relevant assessments, developing the peer support plan, training paraprofessionals to assume facilitative roles, training peer partners, identifying needed modifications and accommodations, coordinating data collection, and then maintaining regular communication with the facilitator and classroom teacher. Now, when thinking about peer support arrangements, classroom teachers can also help identify peer partners. They can contribute to the initial training and support the students as they work together. Now, more broadly, they work to embed collaborative learning activities into their class. They encourage peers to reach out socially to students with autism. They collaborate with special education staff to provide accommodations and modifications that ensure meaningful participation. And they work with paraprofessionals to ensure they are promoting rather than hindering students' social participation and learning. General educators are important partners here. And although not directly involved, related service providers can also play a role in expanding opportunities for or reducing barriers to social interactions and peer relationships in the classroom. A speech-language pathologist could help identify critical social and communication skills that could be taught and reinforced by peers. Physical or occupational therapists could design supports to ensure students have access to the materials and technology and activities that make up the class. And behavior specialists could work with the teacher on positive support strategies that might be implemented in the classroom. So you can see quite a team we have gathered. Now, peer support arrangements are particularly valuable interventions when you have any of the following goals for a student. For example, you want intervention approach here that could be particularly valuable for students who you want to enhance the academic engagement of the student in the full range of classroom activities, increase the number of people from whom the student can turn to for needed help, help the student meet new classmates, help the student learn and practice new social and communication skills, raise expectations among others about what students with autism can learn, and diminish the stigma and negative impact of always having an adult right close by. Now, with this very general overview in mind, and now a sense of who the various stakeholders are within this intervention approach, let's turn to the steps you can use to launch peer support arrangements in your school. And I'll walk through each of these in order, elaborating on what each involves. The starting point of this intervention is the crafting of a strong peer support plan. The student's educational team begins by identifying the social, communication, and other learning goals that could be addressed within a particular general education classroom in which they're enrolled. For example, goals might focus on initiating interactions with peers, asking and answering questions, sharing information, or contributing within a collaborative group. A written peer support plan is then developed to identify how students will participate in various aspects of the class, the roles peers will play in supporting this participation, and the facilitation strategies that paraprofessionals or educators will employ. Now, there are multiple approaches you might use for planning, and I'll come to those in just a minute, but I'd like to first show you some examples of the types of support that you might involve peer partners in providing. On your screen are some examples of academic-related supports peers might provide. And this is not intended to be an exhaustive list, and nor should it constrain you. It's merely intended to kind of stoke your creativity. What I think you'll find is that many of these supports are pretty typical of how any student might support any one of their classmates. Likewise, there are any number of social-related supports that peer partners might provide. And again, I've placed a sampling of these on your screen. Now remember that social interactions also take place in the midst of academic learning, so students might talk about their work and other academic topics as they participate in class with one another. So how do you identify which supports the focused student might receive from their peer partners or other classmates, and which will come from paraprofessionals, general educators, and other school staff? Well, this is where a strong written plan comes in. And I'll share with you 3 variations on planning tools, but each really gets at 4 questions you'll need to answer as a team. First, what are the standards informing curricula, instruction, and assessment in this class? You'll need to know what any student in the class is expected to learn as you think about what aspects of that content the student with autism will also be expected to learn. Second, what are the expectations that general educators hold for all students in this class? You're going to need to know how this classroom runs. What are the ways in which this teacher approaches instruction? And what does it look like to be a learner in this class? Third, what IEP goals will the student work on in this class? Students with autism have individualized educational goals that might supplement or maybe even extend beyond what other students are working on. So you'll want to make sure they get addressed. Fourth, how will the student be supported to participate in all of the learning and social opportunities in this class? And which of these supports will come from peers and which will come from adults? Well, one way to get at these questions is through a tool developed by Lisa Cushing and her colleagues. It's called the Assessment of Instructional Activities. The first column lists different elements that make up most classes. In the second column, the team lists the typical activities and routines taking place within the classroom related to whole class instruction, small group instruction, independent work, other activities specific to that class, homework, assessment, needed materials, and other expectations. For example, you might list how often the teacher has lectures, or has whole class discussions, or class debates. In the second column, the team briefly describes its expectations for all students across each of these activities and routines. For example, you might list what it looks like for students to participate actively in that lecture by listening and taking notes, or during that whole class discussion by sharing ideas and reacting to the opinions of others, or during that class debate by talking with peers about your key arguments and points and organizing them into some kind of cohesive argument. And in the final column, the team outlines the possible adaptations and supports that a student with autism might need to participate meaningfully in each of those activities and routines. For example, peer support strategies are often listed here as an approach for helping students participate more fully in class activities. The student might need help from a peer to confirm his notes are complete and accurate, or prompting from a peer to share a great idea or a personal experience during that whole class discussion, or maybe help entering the group's opening argument into his communication device. When each of these aspects of class is thought about in advance and discussed collaboratively with the general educator, the special educator, the paraprofessionals who are supporting students within the classroom, it really does clarify for everyone exactly how students will participate socially and academically within the classroom. To illustrate what a completed plan might look like, I've placed on your screen an example of Ramon's plan. He's an 11th grade student in Mr. Jakowski's U.S. government course. And as a student with pretty significant disabilities who also uses a communication device, the planning team worked together on an initial plan that outlines what it will look like for him to participate in the breadth of activities that typically take place in Mr. Jakowski's most excellent class. Now, this might be a good place to pause the video and read through that plan. Another approach is a small variation of the first. It involves identifying the ways in which a student with autism will participate in different class activities, the specific supports peer partners will provide during each of these activities, and the ways in which the paraprofessional and general educator will assist the students to work effectively together. There are a couple differences worth pointing out. One is the plan really takes into account two important aspects of the class period that are filled with interaction opportunities. The beginning of class, before instruction starts, and toward the end of class when instruction is completed and students are just hanging out. Now, both require thoughtful consideration of what students, peers, and facilitators might do during this time. The second difference is that this is a much more directive plan. It says what each participant might do at different points in class, and for that reason, it is the version we tend to use most often in our projects. We find peers and paraprofessionals find it to be particularly practical. Here's an example of a completed plan using this format. And as you can see, each section lays out the roles of students, peers, and professionals across 5 different aspects of the class. Let's look at a couple sections briefly. At the beginning of class, there are usually a few minutes between when students arrive and instruction starts. And during this time, Stephen could get out materials for taking notes from the board. He could converse with peers about a social topic, and the upcoming basketball game might be a good choice for him. And he might say hello to peers. His peer partners could prompt Stephen to get out his notebook, copy down information from the board about his assignments, and if Stephen arrives late, which does happen occasionally, they can let Stephen copy down the board information from their notebook. They can also just engage him in conversation, asking about his day, his hobbies, or even his latest culinary adventures, because Stephen is a certified foodie. And of course, they should greet him when he arrives to class. The paraprofessional can encourage the peer partners to engage Stephen in conversation and even provide some conversation starters if they aren't sure quite what to ask him about. Now, Stephen's mom usually sends along what Stephen did over the weekend in a communication notebook with the teacher. The paraprofessional can give the peers ideas for how Stephen will participate and answer any questions that peers might have. And she can also look through the class materials for the day to just make sure she knows how Stephen will be involved. And here's a section describing what happens during lab in earth science class. I won't read all of these through, but again, you'll see the structure of how the student with autism will participate, how the peer partners will support, and how the paraprofessional will facilitate. A third approach places the accent on accessing the social opportunities that exist within the classroom. Here the columns change just a bit. The first asks, how do peers interact with one another and participate? And the idea is to spend some time observing other classmates and writing down what it looks like for them to be part of the class activities and to describe the types of interactions they have within these activities. The second asks, what can the student with autism do to interact and participate with his peers? Now, this is where you'd list out the interactions students could be involved in and the supports they'll need to participate. And the final question asks, what can you do to facilitate the student's involvement in these interactions and activities? And so this is where that role of the facilitator gets outlined. And this is a particularly helpful approach when you're focusing on supporting a student who has very complex communication needs, and her primary goals focus on social and communication outcomes. So here's an example of a planning template using this format. And again, you can pause the video and take a few minutes to look through this approach. Well, with a plan in place, it is time to work with the paraprofessional to prepare him or her for their role as a facilitator of a peer support arrangement. If you already have a close relationship with this person, you probably have a sense of how you might approach equipping them for this role. For some paraprofessionals, this comes quite naturally, but for others, they find it difficult to fade back that direct and constant support. In fact, they sometimes define their role in this way, to be that first line of support for a student. Now, the first thing to do is to have a conversation with a paraprofessional about the goals of the peer support arrangement and about the ways in which students and their peers might work together in the classroom. Now, you might sit down with them and talk about the class. What are the typical routines? What activities are often completed, and what are students expected to do? What does the student with a disability do during these activities? And then your conversation might turn to how students could work together throughout the class, as well as the ways the paraprofessional can support and encourage those ongoing interactions. If the written peer support plan isn't already drafted, you might do a first pass together. Remember, though, that the general educator should also be part of the planning process, and their input into the ways students work with one another will be vital. Next, you'll want to prepare them for the initial meeting with the peer partners. Now, we'll talk more about this orientation meeting in a few minutes. In many cases, the special educator leads this orientation meeting or is at least present for it. But this is also a role that a paraprofessional could assume, and if they do, you'll want to make sure they're prepared. Talk through each of the following roles with them, explaining that they will facilitate discussions by asking questions and sharing ideas. They'll model how to talk respectfully about the student with a disability. They'll answer any questions. They'll provide some general information about the student. They'll help peers brainstorm strategies to support the student with autism during class. They'll set a relaxed tone for the meeting and make it fun and enjoyable for students, at least as much as is possible. Finally, you'll want to emphasize the importance of strong facilitation as students begin working together within the peer support arrangement. The paraprofessional will make sure peer partners are sitting close to their classmate with autism. They'll prompt, reinforce, and provide information to students as needed, and they'll check in with peer partners often to see how things are going and offer any needed help. Now, the prompting and reinforcing and providing of information will happen in the areas of both social interactions and academic support. And so this would be a good time to talk through what it would look like to do each of these things on behalf of the student that he or she will be supporting. Well, you've got a plan in place and a prepared facilitator. You are now ready to identify and invite classmates who will serve as peer partners. Now, a wide range of peers can be effective in these roles. And teachers so often turn to high-achieving students, thinking that, well, there's less chance they'll fall behind when taking on this new support role. But if peer partners who are themselves struggling academically can get involved, they actually benefit substantially from their involvement. I mean, after all, they are getting more adult attention. They're getting more adult feedback. They're more motivated to come to class, and the strategies they use to support their classmate may keep them more connected to the curriculum and be beneficial for them to use themselves. So when selecting peers from within the same classroom, there are a variety of factors that you might want to consider. And as with peer networks, if one of your goals is friendship formation, consider asking the student with autism to identify classmates with whom he or she would like to maybe get to know better. Educators might also consider peers who are of similar ages, who indicate they want to participate, have consistent attendance and will remain involved throughout the semester, have interests and experiences in common with a student, have good interpersonal skills, maybe a willingness to learn, would make a good role model, are likely to receive guidance well from the educator or paraprofessional, and have had positive interactions with the student in the past. Ideally, you are selecting peers who are well positioned to deliver the key supports you outlined in that written plan. And that's why it's so beneficial to craft a plan before selecting peers. Now, invitation for peers to participate can be extended in a variety of ways. I placed on your screen 7 approaches we've seen used in schools. Each has, again, benefits and potential drawbacks, so consider your approach carefully. I've already mentioned the first approach. For example, you might give priority to peers whom the student with a disability wants to get to know. Not every student will be able to offer suggestions, and some of the suggestions may not prove to be a good fit for this particular role, but you might be surprised. For students who are nonverbal, you might spend time observing in the classroom to see who already has a relationship to the student or seems drawn to him or her. It's that classmate who occasionally asks about the focus student when they're absent. That might be someone to consider. Now, brief class announcements might also be made about the general availability of opportunities to provide support throughout the semester. That would be followed by an invitation for interested students to talk with the teacher outside of class for more details. Now, this approach provides an avenue for students to volunteer for this role when educators might not have initially considered them, but it should be done thoughtfully and in ways that do not call undue attention to or stigmatize a particular student. Now, this is the most widely used approach that I've seen, and that has been to have educators or paraprofessionals or other school staff identify students whom they perceive would be effective in a support role, and then extend personal invitations to get involved. If you adopt this approach, make sure to think broadly about who in the class might benefit from being involved. It may be more than those high-achieving students. Some teachers implement peer-mediated strategies for all students in their class, for example, through class-wide peer tutoring, or they opt to rotate students into and out of peer support arrangements over the course of the semester or school year. And this kind of universal peer or rotating peer supports or universal peer supports ideas increases the number of peers who have the opportunity to get to know and work closely with the focus student with autism. And finally, some schools have active peer buddy programs through which peers who are not part of the class end up accompanying the student with autism to the class and then serving in the support role. This does have some benefits, but I would strongly recommend involving students who are themselves part of the class. This results in the student being pulled into the curriculum in a much more effective way. Now, regardless of the approach used, it can be helpful to provide intrigued students with a brief description of their proposed role, an overview of the time commitment, general information about the student with whom they'll be working, and an opportunity to ask questions. Now, in my own work, we've not introduced an interview process for potential peer partners, but some schools have opted to do this informally. And if it's the direction you go, the questions I'll put on your screen might be ones you draw from or adapt to gauge interest and motivation of the peers who volunteer. Some questions you might ask are, how well do you already know the focus student? What interests you most in being part of a peer support arrangement? Have you done something similar in the past? What expectations do you have? Are there aspects of the experience you're especially excited about or worried about? What other school and community activities are you involved in? What experiences have you had that you feel would make you a good peer partner? What questions do you have about this role? What do you hope to gain from this experience? And perhaps the most telling of the questions, have you ever received support from your classmates? And if so, what was that experience like? With 2 to 3 peers selected and your plan in place, it's time for the orientation session. Now, the attitudes, the knowledge, and the skills peers bring to their interactions with students with autism can influence whether and also how relationships develop. Some peers may be uncertain of how to converse with someone who has limited speech or who's maybe they're reluctant to spend time with someone who engages in unfamiliar behaviors, or they're unsure of how to best support someone during different class activities. Again, uncertainty so often leads to avoidance. So providing peers information and guidance related to their interactions and their shared activities with students with disabilities can positively impact their motivation and competence. Now, some peers already have lots of experience and great confidence, but some students will still benefit from receiving some targeted information and strategies prior to beginning their support roles in the classroom. An initial orientation session can help clarify the goals of peer support arrangements, can provide an overview of any expectations related to this new role, and enable students to learn more about their classmate and the best ways to support his or her class involvement. Now, such a meeting can ensure students are comfortable and confident in their new roles, as well as feel adequately supported by school staff. Initial orientation sessions typically can be conducted in about 45 to 60 minutes, and they usually take place outside of instructional time, like during an advisory period or study hall, at lunch, before or after school. And although this training could conceivably be led by any school staff, they are most commonly facilitated by the person who will be directly supporting the students with and without disabilities as they work together in the classroom. That's usually a paraprofessional or a special educator. Now, because peer supported interventions will be implemented somewhat differently across classrooms and students, the content addressed during training sessions should definitely be tailored to prepare students well for the specific context in which they'll be providing support. For example, some peers may be more active in supporting their classmates' academic goals, and other students may be more focused on social and communication goals. Now, each would benefit from more focused attention on targeted strategies in those areas. But there are some common topics that maybe you should consider when planning any orientation for any student. And these might include just having introductions among the students and the facilitator, and they may not know each other yet. They might address the primary reasons for involving peers actively in supporting their classmate with disabilities. Basic information about the interests, talents, and school activities of their partner with a disability. The general goals associated with a particular peer support arrangement. That might be a goal like increasing the number of peers with whom the student interacts, or developing new friendships, or increasing independence and involvement in class, or acquiring particular academic skills. It might address the educational goals of the partner for that class, but describe broadly and in ways that do not breach confidentiality. It will address the importance of maintaining privacy and respectful language. You might touch on strategies for interacting with someone who uses technology or a communication system if this is relevant to the student. Basic instructional and support strategies such as modeling, reinforcing, prompting, constructive feedback. Ideas for effectively motivating and encouraging their partner. Guidance on when to seek assistance from educators or paraprofessionals, and any other responsibilities and expectations specific to their roles in a particular classroom. The written plan provides the focus for a lot of this discussion, and the facilitator can review key elements of the plan and discuss specific ways in which they can provide support during those different types of class activities. Now, when appropriate, the facilitator may demonstrate or role play any of the strategies included on the plan. For example, Matt Brock and his colleagues carried out a study in which peer partners were taught very specific strategies to use to promote targeted goals for students with severe disabilities who had peer support arrangements. These strategies could be modeled by the paraprofessional or the special educator during this initial training. Peers are also encouraged to share their own ideas for additional supports that could be incorporated into the plan. And my experience has been that peers are quite creative. So by the end of the meeting, everyone should be clear about the next steps, as the intervention is going to get launched the next day in the classroom. So as you plan this into orientation, just a few questions you're going to want to answer. Who will lead the orientation sessions? Is it you, the paraprofessional, the general education teacher, or someone else? And when and where will the session be held? What topics will be addressed? Will the student with autism also attend, or would a separate meeting be held first? In our projects, we've had some students with autism who wanted to be part of that orientation meeting and others who had no interest. And finally, how many peer partners will be trained at once? Should peer support arrangements become more widely used in your school, you could bring together multiple peers from different classrooms for some shared initial orientation sessions. Well, shortly after the initial orientation session, peer partners begin working with their classmate on a regular basis in the classroom. Now, this might ensure or require some adjustments in seating arrangements to make sure students are sitting close to one another. Now, during the first week or two, the paraprofessional might continue supporting the student with autism as he or she also begins working with peers. But the peer partners take on an increasingly more prominent role in assisting the student during small and large group instructional formats and interacting socially during appropriate times in class. At the same time, paraprofessionals provide ongoing support and encouragement to the student. They check in regularly with all of the students to solicit feedback and to answer questions. And as students gain confidence in the arrangement and greater familiarity with one another, paraprofessionals take systematic steps to fade their direct support of the students. Although paraprofessionals continue to monitor students' progress and offer any help that's needed, they also begin to shift to a broader support role within the classroom, and they gain additional flexibility to support the teacher and other classmates in all kinds of new ways. As paraprofessionals fade that direct support, they rarely step out of the picture altogether. Instead, paraprofessionals should focus on a variety of facilitation strategies to promote engagement and to encourage connections with peers. For example, they might model for peers how to initiate and extend conversations, or show them how to converse with someone with complex communication challenges. They might call attention to the interests and strengths and experiences or things that students with and without disabilities have in common. They could provide a prompt to the student to use a particular social interaction skill, or help peers interpret any challenging or unusual behaviors exhibited by their classmate. They might redirect students' questions and comments away from the adults and to one another, or just ask additional peers to provide targeted or time-limited supports as needed. Or they might look for ways to create proximity when it's limited or inconsistent. All of these facilitation efforts can take place within the ongoing flow of the class, or paraprofessionals can connect with students right before or after class to share their ideas. Paraprofessionals should also actively monitor the implementation of the peer support arrangement to make sure that all is going as planned. The questions on your screen are intended to prompt reflection by the facilitator on different aspects of the peer support arrangement, including whether the students are in proximity, have the same materials, are actively engaged, are doing the work they're supposed to be doing, are interacting in ways that are consistent with other students in the class, are getting their work done, are enjoying the collaboration, and are truly working together as partners. And you can also fill in your own reflection points based on strategies you might have emphasized in the orientation meeting or on the written plan. Now, another role for paraprofessionals as they fade back their direct support is to collect data on the progress of the student with autism. Whatever the student's individualized goals are for the class, the paraprofessional, with guidance from the special education teacher, could be collecting formative and summative data. For example, I've placed on your screen examples of individualized goals for students with disabilities who had complex communication needs and participated in a peer support intervention led by Elizabeth Biggs and her colleagues. Now, each of these are goals that could be enhanced by working alongside one's peers, but you're going to have to collect data to know whether these goals are actually being achieved. And finally, the paraprofessional can work to ensure the student is turning to more natural sources of support first, before turning to one-to-one paraprofessional support. So, as they observe the student, they can simply consider whether he or she can do each class activity on their own, if given the right technology or adaptive equipment, if provided with some additional skill instruction, if taught specific self-management strategies, or with help from a peer partner or other classmate. Adult support, whether occasional or ongoing, is introduced only when these other avenues of support prove to be insufficient. Well, let me close out this step by just highlighting a few questions you'll need to work through as a team when thinking about the support model. How will the team communicate about future lessons so that supports are in place to ensure the student with autism can access the instruction? Who will adapt and modify materials? Who will give feedback to the peer partners and the student? Who will collect data on the student's IEP goals? Who will model support strategies should the peers need additional guidance? And what's the plan for dealing with inappropriate behavior of the peer partners or the student with autism? Well, ongoing evaluation of peer support arrangements is absolutely essential. It really is the only way you're going to know whether it is having an impact. And even if you perceive everything's going well, collect good data to confirm. And there are a variety of data collection approaches you can draw upon to capture different aspects of the impact, as well as to explore how participating students and staff view the acceptability and the feasibility of this intervention. Well, one of the most direct ways to capture change associated with peer support arrangements is through direct observation. Now, a wide range of measures have been making an appearance in school-based research. I've placed some examples on your screen, and these can be readily adapted for use in the classroom before and after the intervention is underway. Of course, your observation should focus on key outcomes that are most pertinent to the participating student in that setting. In addition to collecting data on student performance, it's also instructive to consider how key stakeholders view the goals and the procedures and the outcomes associated with the intervention. Students with disabilities should be asked about their experiences receiving support from peers, about the extent to which they enjoy working with and getting to know their peer partners, and about their preferences about continuing to receive such support in the future. Most students in our project have loved this support model, but a few have not, and you'll want to know what your students think so you can make any needed adjustments along the way. The questions on the screen are just examples of what you might want to ask students, taking care to adapt them so that students with complex communication challenges have a chance to have their voices heard. Now, peers also have an important perspective to share, so consider asking them about their personal experiences in this role, about the lessons they're learning, the impact they have noticed, and their advice for making the peer support arrangement more effective and more enjoyable. As I mentioned earlier, peers often have great insights into ways of including students well. Example questions are all on your screen. Now, general educators and paraprofessionals can also provide great insights into the implementation requirements of the intervention within the classroom, particularly if you're not there on a regular basis. You might also ask them about the extent to which they feel well equipped to deliver the intervention with adequate fidelity, about the degree to which participating students are engaged and achieving their learning and social goals, and about their own recommendations for strengthening these supports. Well, if you watched the first module or you know anything about me, you probably knew this slide was coming, because the best teachers strive to implement the very best of what we know works for students with disabilities. Research examining the efficacy and the social validity of peer support arrangements among students with disabilities has spanned nearly 2 decades, and the findings are quite compelling. More than a dozen studies have examined the efficacy and the social validity of peer support arrangements. Now, most of these have taken place at the middle school and high school level. You can see some other specifics on your screen. But the key point to make is that this is an intervention that has strong empirical support, an intervention that can be considered an evidence-based practice for improving social outcomes within the inclusive classroom. Now, this research finds that the introduction of peer support arrangements produces substantial increases in the quality and the quantity of peer interactions throughout the class period. It promotes progress on social and communication goals. It provides access to a broad range of individualized supports, and it fosters the development of reciprocated and durable relationships. The great thing is these improvements do not come at the expense of academic engagement and curricular contact. And finally, feedback from both students and staff indicate these interventions are both feasible to implement and they fit well within the classroom context. Well, it's always a good idea to keep abreast of the research literature. And if you're inclined to reading original articles, I'd point you to a range of studies that have been published in this area. And I'd emphasize that this is an area of the literature that is growing rapidly. So find a cup of coffee and a cozy corner and start reading. Well, let me close by offering a few final thoughts on getting started. As with peer network interventions, this is a good place to start small and grow. Try the intervention out, work out the kinks, and then begin applying it in more classrooms with more students. Second, partner with a few general ed teachers and a couple of paraprofessionals and demonstrate some early success. Third, make sure that you are implementing strong inclusive practices before incorporating peer support arrangements. These interventions won't work well if you do not have a clear plan for how students with autism will access the general curriculum and a strong collaborative teaming model in your school. And finally, document and evaluate your efforts so that you can tell a strong story about the impact of these interventions at your school. Well, when it comes to providing an effective education, relationships really do matter. Peer support arrangements are a promising and a powerful avenue by which students with and without autism can learn from and learn alongside one another. Through thoughtful planning, individualized supports, and reflective practices, you can help the students you serve move from the margins to a place of full participation and rich learning and true belonging. So thank you for all you are doing on behalf of students with autism all across this state.